Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Adam Friedland had Lina Khan on his show. Lina Khan is the former Biden White House official. She was the chair of the FTC, which deals in antitrust law and essentially just different laws about what corporations are and aren't allowed to do, especially around mergers and practices towards their consumers. Adam Friedland has been doing these type of political interviews. He comes from sort of what they would call the dirtbag left podcast world and kind of pivoted into doing more serious political interviews, but it still carries a hint of that sort of like sardonic, can't be bothered type quality. So it's hit or miss, honestly. Some of the interviews are really good. It really seems to depend on how genuinely interested he is in the person he's talking to. In this case, it's Lina Khan, who has kind of become an icon of some sort when it comes to meaningfully challenging corporate power in the context of whatever, an administration, the government. She seems to just be a very humble, very smart, very effective person that was working within the government very diligently, going after these companies in a way that made her a lot of enemies. A lot of these companies hated her and seemed to be putting money into different profiles about her to try to drum up negative attention on her name, which is something that they mentioned in this interview a little bit, but it really only seems to have solidified her as somebody that people like broadly, even across the political spectrum. People seem to recognize that Lina Khan is useful when it comes to breaking up some of these larger companies. Although she doesn't really seem to be that interested in being in the spotlight, she seems to keep finding herself in very prominent positions. So here's a few moments from that interview.
One thing I heard you say in an interview was that prior to the establishment of the Third Reich as a centralized power structure, that industrial conglomeration was a big component of it. Is that correct, or am I trying to say words? I feel like I'm copying words that I heard on TV, on Succession, maybe.
Yeah, obviously there were a lot of factors that facilitated the rise of Nazism, but the US after World War II actually commissioned various studies to be like, what just happened and what factors contributed to it, including trying to figure out what was happening in the economy. And they did actually find that growing consolidation across the German economy had basically facilitated the rise of Nazism. You had like more monopolization in certain types of rubber and steel. And generally speaking, there's long been a recognition that concentrated economic power can go hand in hand with concentrated political power. And, I think that's an insight that has been lost more recently, but we're kind of being forced to reckon with again.
So you think Paramount, if they buy Warner Brothers, maybe Barry Weiss will be maybe the kind of global... She doesn't talk shit at all, because she knows all the rules. Do you think the game Monopoly is maybe problematic for people's understanding of monopoly power? Because no one wins at Monopoly and everyone's like, you're a bad guy.
Right.
Everyone's like, it's a disaster. Your dad just relapsed on alcohol. He told your mom that she's just like her mother. Your sister's crying. That's what happens when you win a Monopoly. And you're like, I'm the best guy in the family.
There's a really interesting history of that game where it was actually designed as an anti-Monopoly game. And then it was like, commercialized and made into a kind of a pro-Monopoly game.
Wait, so what was the objective? That everyone has different stuff?
In the original version? I haven't played the original version, though I actually have a version of it. So I need to try it out.
Did you ever ask for a gun? You should have got a badge.
I know, we probably should have.
Yeah.
We did have investigators who went undercover sometimes, and They did have badges.
Deep undercover in Wall Street?
Usually not on Wall Street. Usually, kind of if there was
Menlo
various
Park.
types of frauds or scams or that sort of thing.
Did you send guys to Burning Man to figure out tech corruption?
We didn't have that good idea.
See, had I gone to law school, I would have had that great idea. Because they would have been on Molly, and they would have been like, we're gonna make one company. The whole economy is gonna be one company pretty soon.
Yeah.
and they would have been on ketamine or whatever the hell.
That is a very creative investigative technique.
Can we go back to the FTC and try it? And can we cut that from the episode, because I feel like we cracked it just now. Go to Burning Man. They're all on drugs over there, talking about the singularity.
I guess.
When you enforce a policy, as when you were a commissioner, you oftentimes would file a lawsuit. A lot of discussion has been made about how the judiciary is kind of, is there ever a fear that something could potentially go to the Supreme Court, which is kind of, it's understood to be quite partisan at this point, and 6-3 to the other side? Is there a fear that you could actually fuck those initial regulations that you're trying to enforce?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of strategizing that has to go into, like, does it make sense to appeal this case? Is there a risk of making things worse?
Yeah.
So we definitely have to think that through.
But if you win and they appeal, they're like, we're going to ride this to the top, and then they're going to let us make one company for the whole world.
All right, so some really interesting things here. The point that she makes about Nazi Germany, which the reason Adam brought that up is because that's something she's talked about before, about how the consolidation of corporate power in Germany at the time is part of what paved the way for fascism. Not the only thing, maybe not even the main thing, but certainly it was a material factor that allowed for fascism to happen, even if it wasn't necessarily like the cause or what made people tilt emotionally in that direction. It allowed the instruments of government to become also consolidated alongside that corporate power. And I think that's probably a really important thing to illustrate for people at the moment, that this consolidation of corporate power that everybody is aware of happening even across the aisle goes hand in hand with the consolidation of government that, you know, is historically not in the interest of the people. So anyone who's holding out hope that what Trump is doing to the government, to the economy, will ultimately make better conditions for working people, poor people. It's hard for me to imagine that someone might still think that, but there certainly are people out there who do. And recognize that the consolidation of corporations is what allows for consolidation of government, because if the most powerful economic entities in the country are bigger but helmed by a smaller amount of people, those entities are going to benefit from a government that moves the same way. A government that can make broad, sweeping, hugely impactful decisions on a unilateral basis, because that's somebody that they can access directly. Whereas a more democratized system of government as well as economy is better for individuals, because you have more options, and although things can be slower moving, you also have more recourse, especially in the case of the government. And that's sort of the fundamental logic behind the FTC and Antitrust breaking apart corporations as a solution for, you know, Facebook or Google being so big that everybody kind of recognizes the exploitative and just kind of scammy nature of these companies, especially the fact that they get too big to fail. But by breaking them up into smaller companies and making it so that they no longer are incentivized by the idea of merging, all of a sudden you have companies that are more incentivized to just provide their products rather than trying to figure out how to provide millions of different products at the most cost-efficient rate possible, which usually just leads to what is called enshittification. It would have been great if Adam had used that word in the course of this interview. I'm sure it came up in his research process. Other interesting thing that they mention here that I do want to highlight, what they're talking about with Monopoly, the game of Monopoly. Very interesting story. That used to be called the landlord's game. That's what it was originally called when it was invented. It was invented by Elizabeth McGee, and she was kind of a left-wing radical. She believed in what's known as Georgism, and one of the ideas that he proposed was a land tax, essentially a blanket tax on land that he viewed as a disincentive for companies to buy up more land and a solution for inequality at the time. So that was the logic that McGee used to create this landlord's game, where the only difference was there were two sets of rules. There was prosperity rules, which incorporates this land tax idea, and there was monopoly rules. And monopoly rules is essentially what we know today as the game of Monopoly, But the idea was that the prosperity rules creates a more equitable society where all of the players can win in some various ways. And so not only is that an interesting metaphor for how all of this stuff kind of works, and also an interesting model of how to teach people about different versions of society. But the interesting thing about it is the game caught on because they marketed it a little bit, but didn't have that much budget to push it. And it kind of became more of like a household folk type thing where different people made different versions of their own game. It was kind of like a game of telephone. So the rules of it got tweaked a little bit on its own. And then later it was discovered by the company, the business owner that purchased it from somebody who wasn't the original creator, sold it as though it was his own idea and made it like, oh, this is a pull yourself out from your bootstraps. I came up with this idea during the Great Depression and found prosperity. And then later went and bought the rights to the game from McGee. She sold it for a pretty cheap price, thinking that they were going to market her game alongside Monopoly, and they did a little bit, but essentially Monopoly became the worldwide marketed game, and her version got basically shelved. They basically bought it to kill it. So that's a very fascinating example of how capitalism works, but also the idea of creating something like that and then it catching on as its own concept that different people sort of build off of in different parts of society is fascinating. I think that's a fascinating approach to getting an idea out there. And clearly she had some sort of like radical intention. She wanted to teach people about how society works through that game, but then it ended up getting co-opted so that only the monopolistic part was taught to people, and it was taught on this sort of glorified basis. But that's why even now the game Monopoly has that feeling of like, you know, winning a game of Monopoly is kind of brutal. So all of that is an aside, but just I think it's interesting. So just a couple notes on Mamdani's transition real quick, and then I want to talk a little bit about the new Epstein Files stuff that's coming out right now. Basically, Mamdani has quickly moved into transition mode. He's appointed a panel of all-female transition officials. So they've raised some money for that, a significant sum of money, which came from the same grassroots donors, which is interesting because it sets the stage for a lot of Mamdani's agenda to essentially be helped through this grassroots organizing vehicle that he built throughout his campaign, which I think is an essential part of him being able to get stuff done. Keeping those organizing vehicles attached to his agenda rather than them becoming sort of separate advocacy things is going to be crucial. They're going to have to stay focused and really tightly involved with the administration in order to help. And I don't think most of these things are going to get done without that type of help. They're also focusing on getting some grassroots organizers in the administration, which I also think is a helpful sign. They've received like 50,000 applications from different New Yorkers, people that want to work for the administration. They have put it out there that they're looking for people of all skill levels, entry level, and incredibly experienced, although I'm not sure exactly what the breakdown will be of what they need and how many employees they can staff and that sort of thing. So one concerning element of Mamdani's cabinet so far, he has asked the current police commissioner, Jessica Tisch, I believe, to stay on. And many people, he said that before the election actually happened, and many people viewed that at the time as a little bit of appeasement towards people that might be concerned about his rhetoric on the police. He's credited Jessica Tisch for doing things to highlight and root out corruption, although she also has a pretty broad interpretation of like security in terms of what these different agencies, even at a local level like in New York, should have the ability to surveil without necessarily the mayor's office or anybody else being involved. And so to me that signals that Zoran is not as interested in putting too much focus into that. And look, it is a thing in New York. I mean, 9/11 happened in New York, obviously. So there is a level of national security and being able to keep an eye on attacks that might happen, for example. But as we know, these agencies overreach with that sort of thing. And so I think this shows that Zoran is not that interested in putting too much of his effort in that direction and trying to reform that specifically. And rather, he wants to put focus on this idea of shifting some of the burden that's on NYPD to this more mental health focused type of policing approach, which is something that's been done with mixed results. But really, the reality there is that it's totally possible to do. It's just going to take a lot of money, like a lot, in order to establish that as a thing that broadly across New York people recognize as being able to help them. Somebody will show up and it's a reliable system. You know, it's going to take a lot of money. And so I predict that on policing, that will probably be one of the areas that gets a little bit less attention from Mamdani, and that he may be interested in leaving to some of the people who are already doing that job, which may be a little bit concerning, might open him up to make some progress on some of his other campaign promises. Whether he's going to be, you know, a revolutionary police reformer, I'm not so sure. His asking Jessica Tisch to stay on is not a great indication when it comes to that. So the last thing here is this Epstein stuff that has come up, and I'll just go over the gist of it real quick just so that we understand where exactly we're at. So the House has reached its required number of signatures so that it will have a vote on whether or not the Epstein files should be released by the DOJ. And because of the nature of the House and the sentiments of people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and other Republican and Democratic politicians, it will probably pass the House. There's enough votes for it to pass the House, and then it's going to go to the Senate. So it's hard to imagine a scenario where this passes the Senate. Then it would have to get signed by Trump. But the interesting dynamic here is that there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to do it. So the thing that's fascinating, though, is that as soon as the House goes back into business, all of a sudden we're getting more files. So you can only imagine that if this were to pass the House, more stuff is just going to keep coming out, because there are parts of the House that do have purview to release certain things, but not the broad thrust of the files that they're trying to get the DOJ to release. So putting the pressure on the Senate to do that would be a good thing. It would be a complete shift of focus, because most of the talk about this has been happening in the House. As for what is coming out right now, you're essentially getting emails that Jeffrey Epstein sent to various people up until pretty much right when he was arrested the second time, which ultimately culminated in his death in jail. And he was talking a lot about various figures like Prince Andrew, talking with Peter Thiel, you know, some suspicious messages sent there, Steve Bannon, and also Donald Trump. He talked about Donald Trump a lot, using weird, cryptic language like Donald Trump is the dog that didn't bark, meaning that there's a suspicious lack of noise coming from Donald Trump. I think that's being used to imply that Epstein might think that Trump had to do with informing on him or telling somebody to investigate him at some point. I think that's what's being said there. And also a pretty bombshell statement to Ghislaine Maxwell. The dog that didn't bark thing was in an email thread that he sent to Ghislaine Maxwell, in which he also said that Trump spent hours alone with a victim, a name that's blocked out that says victim, and she never said anything about it. This was one of the accusers of Epstein. They were pointing out that she never said anything about Donald Trump. Again, also seeming to build on this idea that he informed. So that would mean that he was in fact alone with the victim of Jeffrey Epstein for hours, but also that he was suspiciously not on the record and accused of such. Which, as I've pointed out, when it comes to intelligence informing, it gets very confusing and cloudy. But it seems to me that Donald Trump was involved in all of this stuff, obviously, and then at some point decided to use his leverage against Jeffrey Epstein, probably for the reason that he acts so weird about it now, because it implicates him. He may have gotten caught at some point and decided to flip on Epstein. And it seems like Jeffrey and Ghislaine were suspicious about that all the way back to like 2011, and then up through 2019. We're having conversations about how best to navigate this public spectacle behind Jeffrey Epstein being a pedophile and Donald Trump being implicated in it. So anytime Trump comes up, they get really weird and cryptic. What's fascinating about this is that these go up through when Donald Trump was president the first time, and even discusses meetings that they had, I think as late as like 2018 or 2019. I think it's fascinating and hilarious that the second the House comes back in session, which, by the way, did mean that Senator Mike Johnson had to swear in the Democrat from Arizona that he was refusing to swear in. And as soon as the House gets back in business, all of a sudden these files start coming out. So I have to imagine that Trump hates that and is furious about it. And if this gets passed quickly, it will probably go to the Senate and not be something that Trump can put a cork in easily. I think it was a little bit easier for him to do that with the House, where he could put pressure on Mike Johnson to call a recess. But now that they have to reopen the government, they have to pass this legislation, they have to deal with this Epstein stuff, and then it's going to go to the Senate and probably just continue to be a thing that they hear about a lot. The Senate has the option to not take it up, but I imagine MAGA world is probably not going to let them do that. So now, up through this dispute in the Senate is going to be the perfect time to agitate about this, and it'll probably be an important strategic move to figure out how this Epstein file stuff ties in with the inevitable come around on the shutdown fight, which is going to happen again in December or January, in terms of whether we're just going to come back to this filibuster impasse trying to pass a budget bill, because the Republicans are probably not going to make good on their pinky promises that they made to Democrats. So all of that's going to be happening in the Senate in the next couple months, and is probably going to become a very defining moment in Donald Trump's presidency, especially if Epstein stuff keeps coming out that looks damning. This is already dominating the news cycle, as well as if the government shuts down again, and specifically if this Epstein stuff is in the zeitgeist and the Democrats have the opportunity to shut the government down again, that could create a very bad situation for Donald Trump. So fingers crossed on that.